Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I will present an article, Mental Health in 2023. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hello. Mental health. What about her? Now that we've captured your attention with this dynamic montage, it's time to answer the questions it raises. The public discussion around mental health has gained momentum over the past 20 years. Where in the recent past it was a great shame to admit that you have some problems in your head, today many of us seek our diagnoses with the excitement of reading our own zodiac sign. Countless apps constantly tempt you to identify and treat your mental flaws with a simple click. Is it that you don't feel like working because you actually have ADHD? Did your productivity decrease because your father was emotionally distant when you were young? The pandemic also contributed heavily to the discourse, so it became quite obvious that this mental health, it's kind of a real thing. It seems that if people are locked in their own homes for 60 days, and they don't see anyone anymore, they start to stop working properly. European Union reports shows that especially young people between the ages of 18 and 29 have acquired various mental illnesses as a response, such as depression or anxiety. If the kind of conditions imposed by the pandemic clearly lead to mental illness, then we can ask what other conditions can lead to them? And what exactly are mental illnesses? The proliferation of psychiatric language from the highest chambers of parliament to the smallest Instagram windows. It gives the feeling that science is galloping forward in this direction and that we have more tools today as ever to diagnose dysfunctional minds. This notion, it's terribly problematic because, as we'll see, on certain levels it's completely true. And on others it is completely false. The situation is really complex. Mental illnesses are not diseases in the classical sense of the word. Basically, to be diagnosed with a disease, a dysfunction of some part of you must be noticed. The observation part is quite important. To be diagnosed with diabetes, for example, you take some tests that show that your body accumulates too much glucose in the blood, that he can no longer properly process the food he receives. Based on these tests, you have or don't have the disease. For mental illness, there is no such thing. Despite continued efforts in the field of psychiatry, no biological index has ever been found on the basis of which it can be diagnosed. Some mental illness. Depression has never been seen under a microscope. Schizophrenia. It has never been found in the brain, although it has been looked for by MRIs in hundreds of studies. What is more clear is that, sometimes, after many years of living with schizophrenia, some discrete abnormalities can appear in the brain. But even so, these are the consequences of the disease, not its causes. It's like finding out on an MRI that an untreated diabetic no longer has a leg. This discovery tells you nothing about the process which led to this structural anomaly of the person's body. Medicines used for these diseases, they work like drugs that alter the normal functions of the brain and somehow, with these changes, sometimes they manage to help and sometimes they don't. Why it sometimes works, and at other times it does not, remain a matter of speculation. Psychiatry, since it appeared 200 years ago, always desperately sought to find the precise place in the brain where the disease and problem came from, something tangible, so that it can take its place comfortably alongside the other medical sciences. Because if there is nothing objectively concrete in this science, if there is never anything measurable on which to base a diagnosis, then what kind of science is more accurate? Probably the greatest victory that the field of psychiatry has registered in terms of legitimacy has been in the last 30 years, when word spread that depression and other mental illnesses were caused by chemical imbalances in the brain. That sounds pretty scientific, right? Someone must have measured the serotonin value there, and instead of 83, as usual, 32 came out, far too little, clearly depression. But the idea of chemical imbalance as the cause of depression is just a myth, born, in principle, from various marketing campaigns. Psychiatrists then embraced this myth because it was useful, it sounded like something concrete, something they could tell patients so that they would come to terms with the disease more quickly, not be so mystified anymore. of the origin of the very black cloud under which he is, to accept that the origin is only a wrong pulsation of the brain, an organ error, which we can correct by delivering these extremely powerful drugs that put him in his place. We will explore this myth and its consequences later. But first, some more general qualifications with which to set off. On the one hand, there is clearly reality. Mental disorders that can severely complicate a person's life. Just because depression doesn't show up on tests, just because you can't see paralyzing anxiety under a microscope, doesn't mean it manifests. Of the human brain are not very real, debilitating phenomena. On the other hand, the medical field that proclaims its authority over these disorders has never been able to escape of some fundamental uncertainties. So when we are told there is a real epidemic of mental illness today, that hundreds of millions of people have serious problems with depression and anxiety, what do we mean by this? That hundreds of millions of people tripping on the street spontaneously acquired a chemical imbalance in their brains. What makes them stop working properly? As psychiatry has never fully demonstrated itself any ability to objectively measure anything, the causes of this epidemic remain a matter of interpretation. And then there is a huge difference if you interpret this phenomenon as a chemical imbalance located in each individual body, for which only that man is responsible, or if these symptoms are caused by the environment in which we grow and live. The language around these issues. It is automatically interpretive. If we all suffer from mental illness, then we probably have one defect of an organ which does not allow us to function properly. But how, exactly, should we operate? What is that normality that we should fulfill in the year 2023 and we fail due to our own defect? Because if it's still a problem of interpretation, another way to interpret the situation is that maybe all these symptoms in mass, it represents absolutely no defect, but a healthy reaction of human beings faced with a hostile environment. Maybe we have some healthy brains submerged in a toxic environment. And then the name of the disease becomes a fundamentally political issue. Where is the disease? In man or in the environment? In the case of classic diseases, if some people live near a factory that pollutes their water, people drink it and get sick, one can conclude quite easily how, behold, the water is toxic and now produces these effects in humans. By the same token, if it were a mental illness, it's like completely abstracting from the factory. People get sick for mysterious reasons, spontaneous chemical imbalances that have nothing to do with the environment. The symptoms must be treated strictly and not a word can be said about the plant. Which factory? Part of the drug revolution of psychiatry in the 1980s. It was precisely a proud severing of the link between mental disorders and the environment. The ability to treat various mental disorders with drugs denotes much more seriousness. Scientific than speculating on the context of a man's life. So it's unscientific. Let us say that a man's life experiences have produced these disturbances in him. It is not quantifiable. Much more quantifiable is the fact that, we give drugs, his behavior changes, at least a little, at least temporarily. Amazing, congratulations to us all. Even so, it is true at the same time that currently for many people these drugs are the only option available today to improve their lives. So the discussion is very complicated. Although it's always true, I'd like to say it explicitly this time. That what follows is not any kind of objective analysis of anything, it's just what I understand from the things I've read. And from the things we have experienced. So it's just a perspective, mine, and as such, it cannot be completely right or completely wrong. With that said, let's start with the beginning. The beginnings of psychiatry. The history of psychiatry is very much a horror story. In the last 150 years, such moments of fundamental confusion regarding the object of study can be found in it. And such brutality that perhaps a medieval vestige of medicine has been best preserved here. This history is also very long and complicated, so I will try to outline it. Just enough to have a little background for the present that we'll eventually get to. Medieval theory of equilibrium. Humors in the body was scientifically dismantled only after 1850, when diseases, they begin to be explained by the theory of microbes and by the observation of irregular cell behaviors, which can lead to cancer. Many diseases thus become as concrete as possible, tangible. There is a microscopic physical something acting on something else. And this is how diseases appear. Moreover, if you find a substance that kills those microbes, or prevent their multiplication, then you can almost magically cure diseases that are otherwise considered incurable. In this atmosphere of effervescence and excitement, the idea that mental illness is also gaining momentum. They also have some sort of biological cause. Perhaps there is somewhere, undiscovered, the germ of madness. Or maybe people are crazy because of anatomical brain defects, a suggestion reasonable for the time. So for a while, in this medical revolution, about 20 to 30 years, in the late 19th century, the main approach to insanity was to wait for the person to die, and then dissect his brain in hopes of finding the source of the problem there. At this point, there is general chaos in the diagnostic chapter, but among the most common diseases, however, there was masturbatory dementia and female hysteria. One of the most clear ways to go crazy was to masturbate too much. Female hysteria was also a special type of madness, which seemed to particularly hit women who didn't do as they were told, and generally, they displayed an excessive level of opinions and feelings. Years pass, thousands of brains are dissected and examined under the microscope, and yet the anatomical source of the madness is not found. The brains of psychotic people in asylums offered no clues as to what was wrong with them while they were alive. So in the late 1800s, some doctors start signaling that it's stupid what's happening, because we don't even know what diseases we're looking for in the brain. To have any chance of finding anything, you must first know what you are looking for. What are these diseases? Is it one disease, or are there several different ones? How do they manifest over time? This is how the first great ramification of mental illness appears, which continues its effect to this day. A doctor conducts the first large study among patients and their relatives in which data is collected on an unprecedented scale about patients' personal circumstances and symptoms over time. The conclusion, finalized in 1899, was that there are two broad types of insanity: dementia praecox and manic depression. Over time, they get the names of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Kraepelin then differentiated them not by symptoms, because they had similar symptoms, but by prognosis. Schizophrenia was the one that never went away, and it could not be improved, whereas bipolar disorder can. So what does Kraepelin introduce? Is the idea that mental illnesses should not be diagnosed based on individual symptoms, but on their evolution over time, of the pattern according to which they appear and disappear or not. In Romanian, we lack a perfect word equivalent to pattern, but it's about the pattern. About the pattern, the pattern followed by symptoms over time. Depending on how your symptoms evolve, you had one disease or another. The difference was also that schizophrenia was assumed to be based on a defect in the brain that leads to the self-destruction of neurons, whereas bipolar disorder depended more on inner emotional states, on otherwise normal feelings. Which drives me crazy. In this way, a fundamental distinction remains, to this day in mental illness, between those that theoretically have a more pronounced physical origin, and are permanent, and those that depend on affective states. And they can be temporary. It is worth mentioning here, again, that no physiological origin was found further of any mental illness, and this distinction has de facto remained standing despite the fact that it is no more substantiated scientific today than 120 years ago. The huge problem here is that no one can tell which disease is permanent and which disease is temporary. If we are to be even more serious, no one can say what disease it is, period, because these diseases are just names for various groupings of problematic human conditions. And then, in the conditions in which there are such wide interpretive beaches, and not anchored in anything concrete, depending on how a patient is treated, his problem can turn from temporary to permanent. Or, in happier cases, from permanent, temporary. In other words, how the disease is treated can dictate, at least in part, its characteristics. It probably sounds complicated now, but we'll keep revisiting this issue. While Kraepelin was working on these distinctions, the anatomical approach to mental disorders found a great opponent in Freud. In 1892, Freud et al. He ingeniously argues that hysteria cannot possibly have physiological origins. They note that patients suffering from hysteria sometimes had partial paralysis as a symptom, which made absolutely no anatomical sense, such as just paralysis of the palm. So the origin of the disease. It had to be clear in that person's mind, not in biology, because the paralysis was as the patient believed it to be. That a paralysis might work, from hearsay. It begins to be accepted, therefore, that the mind is strong enough and mysterious enough to cause concrete physical symptoms without a biological defect behind it. In 1895, Freud goes even further and says that so that the mental illness of the respective man depends on what he suffered in his life, of his life story. An admirable conclusion. Except that in the following years, Freud goes even further and says that in any case of hysteria, when a clinician traces the distress to its source, there is always sexual abuse that happened in childhood, at the hands of an adult or a parent. Something scandalous. In the following year, however, he changes his mind and says that he was wrong, that it is not about abuse. That really happened, but memories of childhood sexual fantasies. So it wasn't real abuse, but fantasies that people had when they were little, then buried, then remembered as real. We don't have to go too deep into it here. In my mind it seems perfectly possible that Freud had come across a lot of people who had actually been sexually abused as children and, coming across so many cases, Freud says it can't be true, so there's probably something else going on here. But who knows how prevalent or not such abuses were in the late 1800s. However, Freud became famous in a very short time, and his fundamental argument was that the mind is infinitely more complex than had been estimated until then. He divides the mind into conscious, subconscious, and unconscious, and says that most of our existence is determined by what lies in the unconscious layer, and that our everyday thoughts are only the very proverbial tip of the iceberg. He himself kept using this iceberg metaphor. In his view, mental illness, or neuroses, had their origins in a tense content of the unconscious. The treatment, therefore, was to talk to the patient until those deep-seated problems surfaced. And, once revealed and discussed, they are resolved. A perspective perhaps a bit too optimistic, but, if anything, a huge step in a much more reasonable direction. This change, however, during only about 50 years, it was radical. It goes from expecting people to die, to dissect their brains, to the revolutionary idea that you could talk to them and thereby alleviate their symptoms. As the biological approach to mental problems still failed to produce any new evidence in its favor, little by little it is accepted in wider and wider circles that mental illness is part of the human experience of life, and that they are caused by some level of suffering. But Freud was completely determined that that level of suffering always has a sexual content. In 1914, he calls this approach psychoanalysis, but already at this point many of his followers become exasperated by his insistence on sexuality and begin to forge their own paths, the most famous defector being Carl Jung. Jung retains many categories and ideas, but he then explores them without always linking them to sexuality, which he considered only one factor among many. He was writing in 1917. Although these notions gained more and more momentum, a skepticism was always kept alive that considered that it was still likely. There are physiological origins of these disorders, we just haven't found them because we don't have them. Still a sufficiently performing microscope. The situation was very frustrating anyway, because many psychiatrists wanted to be real doctors who cut things and give medicine. I don't sit and listen to the opinions and feelings of crazy people. And a big win for them came in 1913, when it was shown that a certain very common type of insanity is actually caused by syphilis. This is demonstrated gloriously by dissecting brains. and finding there in abundance the bacteria responsible for syphilis. So the idea of something very concretely microscopic as the physiological origin of insanity acquires a new very great momentum. If there is neurosyphilis, then perhaps there are other germs of madness. Despite the resulting excitement, in the years that followed nothing new was discovered wrong with the organ called the brain, and yet the treatments on it. They became more and more aggressive. For a while people with severe mental disorders began to be treated by infecting them with malaria, the idea being that the organism as a whole undergoes such an intense shock that perhaps something happens. Then insulin is discovered and the fact that if you give too much to a man he goes into a kind of coma, which maybe helps, who knows. Newspapers are filled with headlines about how there is now a new treatment. Miracle for insanity, hypoglycemic coma. And if the goal is to shock the body, after all, why not a real electric shock? An Italian neurologist casually observed in the mid-1930s that one way to tranquilize pigs before they were slaughtered was to electrocute them. After the electrocution, the pigs became downright reasonable. So can't we calm down? And people also like this? Said and done. The neurologist finds a man on the street who did not seem to be in his right mind, and decides to electrocute him to see what happens. He then reports that things went well, but any change produced by these treatments was usually treated as progress. Of all these medieval methods of dealing with mental illness, electroshock therapy. It is the only one that remains in use today all over the world. When you really don't know what to do with the man, and nobody has patience with him anymore, give him a few 100 volts in his brain and we'll see what happens. It is the medical equivalent of it. But if I punch you in the mouth, won't you be cured of depression? But not just one punch, the treatment involves about 12 sessions in which he is still electrocuted in the hope that he will shake off the mental disorder on you, that there is no other scientific reasoning. Next, 1.4 million people are electrocuted every year around the globe as a last desperate measure in the face of depression. This is considered reasonable. Give people some mushrooms that grow in the ground, but in a guided psychotherapeutic context, also as a last resort, it is something much too extreme. And completely illegal, and we probably have another 10 years to wait until someone figures it out. How a lot of money could be made from it. Returning to the past tense, the most explicit method to cure mental illness by hand, medical, surgical, beautiful, came in the late 1930s. In the form of a lobotomy. For the invention of lobotomy, a procedure by which they destroyed themselves. Various brain connections until that human became as close to a pleasant pet as possible. A Portuguese named Agos Moniz received the Nobel Prize in 1949. Finally, there was a clear and concrete intervention that made the patient less annoying. And therefore, practically be cured. It is worth recalling here that all this time the border between what was mental disorder and what was just socially immature behavior was very fine. On a list of some of the reasons which resulted in people being committed to an American asylum between 1864 and 1899. We find, hit on the head by a horse, imaginary female problems, hysteria, immoral life, masturbating for 30 years, reading novels, overtaxing mental powers, selfishness, superstitions, and vicious vices. Most lobotomies, worldwide, were made on women, where the line between appropriate behavior for a young woman and mental illness. It was decided by a gathering of men. In general, psychiatry, from its beginnings, grew up enormously around very educated and scientific men who were trying to figure out, objectively, what's wrong with women if they don't sit in their place. Among the most famous cases of the tragic lobotomies, Rosemary Kennedy, the younger sister of the assassinated American president, is found. In 1941, when she was 23, her father decided that her behavior was too irritable and a sexual appetite far too pronounced for a member of the Kennedy dynasty, so he decided to lobotomize her. As a result, she was left disabled for life and lived another 64 years in these days, semi-paralyzed, with great difficulty speaking. This was considered, however, a failed lobotomy, success was when mental activity was destroyed in some way. As completely as possible without affecting, however, the man's ability to go to the toilet alone. Then it was a medical victory. We can safely estimate that most people who ended up receiving these destructive treatments did not go through any very rigorous diagnostic process. Maybe you lived in constant psychosis, or maybe you were just an annoying person to the people around you, who reads too much and masturbates too enthusiastically. Some very determined doctors even lobotomized children. And the practice continued in some European countries and America until the mid-1960s. All this time, however, the field of pharmacology was enjoying tremendous momentum and riding discovery after discovery. There were now new drugs that could defeat pneumonia, tuberculosis, diphtheria, and all sorts of other infectious diseases now curable with antibiotics. In the early 1950s, American President Eisenhower declared war against the microbes and demanded that they surrender unconditionally, that they had no chance. In order to find these new miracle drugs, all kinds of substances were tested, more and more strange, the research process being intensely fueled by the despair of the Second World War. Penicillin, for example, was discovered in 1928, but it took 15 years to find a way to produce quantities large enough to be distributed to the general public. The need became urgent, however, because soldiers kept dying of infections from their wounds, infections that could have been treated with penicillin, and they weren't. In any case, there is great excitement about what the next disease will be, which will disappear, defeated by the new powers of medical technology. The first great drug. The first drugs that sparks the pharmacological revolution in the field of mental illness was called thorazine, a substance which is accidentally discovered to have a strong sedative effect. Tested on several hundred rats, the thorazine seemed to render these creatures completely uninterested in their surroundings, not even moving, and yet they were aware. The effect seemed interesting, so it was decided to test it on humans. In 1952, people taking were described as follows. This being the case, the drug was hailed as a veritable lobotomy in a pill. You no longer had to mess with cutting into the patient's brain, because there was now a pill that did just that. It should be emphasized that this substance is still widely used today. In the same way, accidentally, the first drug used for moderate sedation is also discovered. While looking for something else entirely, a certain derivative of a disinfectant is found to function as a muscle relaxant. Total in mice. The mice were temporarily paralyzed but conscious. The substance is then modified to have an effect that lasts for several hours and begins to be sold as a soothing law under the name of Milltown in America. As apparently everyone needed to calm down a bit, Milltown sells in completely unexpected quantities, so the other pharmaceutical companies, they start looking for opportunities to develop some similar drugs. The biggest competitor appeared in 1960 under the name Librium, the first widely used benzodiazepine, the precursor to Valium, of diazepam that would dominate the painkiller market. Thus appear, therefore, in the early 1950s, the first antipsychotic and the first anxiolytic. All that was missing was the first antidepressant, which appears in 1957 as a derivative of a substance used as fuel for World War II rockets. In her name, iproniazid. This substance was originally being tested for its ability to cure tuberculosis, except that in these attempts it was discovered that tuberculosis patients who took it became much more energetic, they danced, sang, seemed happy. This being the case, it turns out that all they needed. Sad people had a little rocket fuel in them to get them going again. In this way, between 1954 and 1957, the first major psychiatric drugs appeared on the market. Note that they do not appear in response to any identified disease, any progress in the understanding of mental mechanisms, but strictly as accidentally discovered substances. That it would have sedative, calming, or energizing properties. Thorazine was originally considered a major tranquilizer, Milltown a minor tranquilizer, and iproniazid a psychic energizer. In their early days, the companies that made them, pressured by Freudians who insisted that mental illness was found in thoughts not in the brain, they also said that. Equally, in 1955, a psychiatrist stated that. And yet, despite this initial honesty, these so-called drugs that simply changed the behavior of an individual, like any other drug, already in 1963, after only a few years, become called antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, and antidepressants. They ride intense excitement. Brought into society by antibiotics and increasingly presenting themselves as mental antibiotics, which cures people of the infectious disease of mental instability. But them. It was just some drugs. It's like discovering that you can calm down anxious people by giving them heroin. Perfectly true, but that says nothing about the underlying disorder that should be treated. The problem with these drugs was that, being toxins, brutalizing the human body, all had strong adverse effects that became progressively worse over time. Again, sure, you cure someone's anxiety in the short term by giving them heroin, but what does that person look like after 5 years of treatment? Is she cured? Is it better? Is it worse? Everything calmed down, or not? We will return to the issue of drugs, now a few observations about the wider framework in which they landed. DSM. In an effort to systematize the field of psychiatry, in 1952 the first DSM appeared, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, made by the American Psychiatric Association. Today we define mental health according to the 5th edition of this manual, published in 2013, revised in 2022. In the first edition, in 1952, 106 mental disorders were identified, today there are 374. The first 2 editions of this manual did not enjoy resounding success, because they were intensely contested, even by the people who used them. Categories and diagnostic criteria. They were too vague, so 5 different doctors seeing the same patient could very easily to arrive at 5 different diagnoses, which they often did. Beyond that, textbooks still relied on a supposed connection between physiological brain defects and mental illness, something that had never actually been proven. By 1974, also, the DSMs classified homosexuality as a mental illness. It was removed from the textbook only because there had been protests against this classification for years. Finally, members of the American Psychological Association met and voted to remove it, thus making the greatest success of psychiatry up to that time. This being the situation, in the 1960s a strong anti-psychiatry movement was born, who enthusiastically identifies all the holes in the supposed scientific basis used by the doctors to declare people mentally ill. And indeed, you had a choice of holes. The anti-psychiatry movement basically argued that there are no mental illnesses, that they are just social constructs, some punitive labels placed on people who do not conform to the system's requirements. In all this context, psychoanalysis was much more palatable, and it dominated the psychiatric space. Until the 1980s. At least psychoanalysis did not claim to have all the answers, but on the contrary, it declared from the start that we are bathing in an infinite mystery, which we can only partially explore. Let's tease it out a little, through decades of non-stop talk aimed at airing out the unconscious. Even this version, in the end, did not turn out to be ideal, so psychiatry was in a real moment. Crisis of legitimacy. He had an identity disorder. Very problematic in psychoanalysis. There was also the fact that he did not use pharmacological treatment at all, because he did not believe that drugs could cure a disease of thoughts. The solution to this crisis eventually came in the form of a completely revolutionary edition of the DSM, edition number 3, published in 1980. Any link is abandoned, explicit with alleged unproven defects of the brain and offset instead by a scientific statistical rigor. The manual now identified 265 mental disorders, and all came with a set of diagnostic criteria. Brand new, state-of-the-art. To confirm the presence of a particular disease in a patient, he had to check a minimum number of symptoms from that condition, 2 out of 3, 3 out of 5, 6 out of 49. One is now identifying, for example, the mental illness called overanxiety disorder, which you qualified for if you had. What was revolutionary about this manual was that it finally offered this long-awaited level of systematization, detailed enough to appear scientifically respectable. He also fulfilled the essential role to provide a common, pragmatic language around which various institutions can coagulate. How to do research. How government money is provided, how new drugs are developed and prescribed, how they are reimbursed by the insurance companies if we do not have clear disease categories, if we do not know to what extent. We are talking about the same thing. These needs were pressing enough to give up precious things in the face of, look ladies, how little we fundamentally know about what and how mental illness is. It is no coincidence that the DSM-3 appears in the very year 1980, the symbolic birth date of neoliberalism. There was, at this point, an enormous amount of money to be made in the field of psychiatry. And there had to be at least some consistency in how we put these things on paper. If you had these symptoms, for example, there could finally be a clear consensus between the doctor, the government and the health insurance companies that you need to take diazepam, that you are really sick. The criteria for mental illness become also based explicitly on the ability to adapt to work, school, or household chores. If you weren't productive at work, if you weren't good at school, if you didn't feel like cleaning the house and cooking, all these things become symptoms of mental illnesses. In the second edition of the DSM, since 1968, the words work, home and school appear a total of 5 times. In 1980, work appears 72 times, home or housework 59 times. And school 91 times. This third edition of the DSM greatly expands the parameters of what can be called mental illness, in language vague enough to encompass any kind of behavior, as I could see. In subsequent editions of the manual, things evolved the same way, the categories have widened more and more to include us all. It rarely exists anymore. Any human behavior that cannot be considered the symptom of any mental dysfunction. In edition number 5 of 2013, we find 288 references to the workplace, 109 in domestic work and 257 in school. Exists today, for example, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, an apparent mental illness that some women suffer from. In which, through such categories, the DSMs continued the proud psychiatric tradition of pathologizing female existence, so if, around your period, your productivity and efficiency drop, it means you have this mental illness, and the treatment for her is an antidepressant. Today, if you are a shy person, you have SAD, social anxiety disorder. If you are a child, there is, in addition to the much debated ADHD, ODD, oppositional defiance disorder, a mental illness in which children are defiant and irritable in relation to parents and adults who exercise authority over them. The question is not whether there are such difficulties more or less pronounced, but whether or not how to approach them. That mental illness is not an incredibly stupid way to put the problem. Because despite the uncertainty around these labels, the drugs that are prescribed following these diagnoses have the most definite and powerful effects, and these effects have been, from their appearance until now, the subject of infinite controversy. These controversies are difficult to summarize in a few words without talking nonsense, and the subject. It's very sensitive because, good, bad, there are a lot of people who are actively addicted today of these substances. I said that the DSM-3, starting in 1980, gave up the claim to know chemical imbalance, some biological origin of these diseases, but this idea re-emerges in a fundamental way, anyway, under the notion of chemical imbalance. A second-generation antidepressant played an essential role here, appeared on the market in 1988, the miracle drug called Prozac. He was explicitly promoted as a wonder drug that cures depression, because compared to the previous poisons, developed in the 1950s, the drug had some less dramatic side effects, it was harder to overdose, and it didn't necessarily seem like it would damage your brain for life. Prozac was a new class of drug called SSRIs. In Romanian, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Without getting into the intricate details now, what these substances do is allow for greater accumulation of serotonin in brain synapses. By this point in 1988, there had already been a considerable number of studies still looking for a relevant correlation between depression and serotonin and had not found it in any convincing way. Some were discovering that very depressed people have normal serotonin levels, others artificially lowered serotonin levels of individuals in the hope of causing depression, and yet nothing happens. However, the Prozac seemed to do something, one way or another. Some people felt better when they were taking it, and then there was all that marketing behind this revolutionary drug. It was the first antidepressant really new which, apparently, used the latest medical technologies. The myth of chemical imbalance. It is explicitly advertised in the advertisements for drugs in this class, of which I offer a selection here. The one for Prozac clearly stated that it was used to bring serotonin levels closer to normal. The depression is therefore obviously caused by a serotonin deficiency, which is now being repaired. Of this medicine. Although it is unclear to what extent psychiatrists themselves believed in this simplification, she was a very useful tool in quickly getting people to take Prozac. The reason you are depressed. It's that you have a chemical imbalance. Take this medicine and it will balance you, bring you back to normal parameters. Comparisons with classic diseases were also frequent, with patients being told that just as a diabetic needs insulin, so you need extra serotonin too. These things are still said today. There is, however, a very serious extension of this reasoning, in the form of, like a diabetic. She has to take insulin for the rest of her life, and you will have to take this antidepressant for the rest of your life, to compensate for your natural deficit. At this point it should be noted that the field of American psychiatry, where the tone is set for these things, it's incredibly connected to pharmaceutical companies, and in a very obvious way. Almost all the studies that are done on the effectiveness of these drugs, they are paid for by the pharmaceutical corporations that make the drugs, and studies that don't. Some comfortable conclusions simply remain unpublished. In America, at least, you hardly find any psychiatrist from the American Psychiatric Association, the entity that publishes the DSMs, which is not heavily sponsored by these corporations, so the economic impetus for all these movements was always as present as possible. And it is by no means a minor factor. Under these conditions, after a simple calculation, it is quite clear that it becomes important that more and more people take these drugs for as long as possible. Also speaking from the calculations, without anyone having who knows what evil intention, the fact emerges that healing anyone is counterproductive. If all the people are cured, then who else buys these drugs? Lucky for them, then, that these substances don't even have the ability to heal anything. The myth of chemical imbalance isn't just a harmless sweetening of the pill so it slides down your throat more easily. His grounding produced, over time, a fundamental distortion of what mental illness is or is not. No psychiatric medication works by compensating for a physiological deficit, because it has not been proven. Never any deficit. Medicines used to treat depression do not cure any abnormality in the brain, but creates one. The way they work is that they literally destroy the natural serotonin system, so that the human brain abnormally accumulates more serotonin. The reason why these drugs only start to take effect after 2 to 3 weeks is that is how long it takes. The brain's natural mechanisms break down. We know that when it comes to drugs, whatever you administer to them, the brain makes an effort to adapt and compensate for the effect so that to get back to a level of normality. The drugs used in psychiatry are also drugs, not some mental insulin, so the brain does what it can to compensate for the dubious forces, which now push him to bathe in completely erratic amounts of serotonin. It does this mainly by decreasing its number of receptors, decreasing the number of ears to pick up all that signal. Only after about 2 to 3 weeks, this self-regulation process is overwhelmed and breaks down, can no longer compensate. As a result, man now lives with an abnormal amount of serotonin in the body. So what these drugs do is the opposite of myth. They do not resolve any chemical imbalance, they create one. This is what people have discovered, who were making Prozac in the early 1980s, that this class of drug was producing its effects by creating abnormal brain function. Antipsychotic drugs, in turn, it works by disrupting the dopamine system, forcing the brain to be less receptive to dopamine. This, when it works, creates a distance between man and his chaotic and dysfunctional thoughts. Thoughts become less compelling, motivation and temptation to pursue them decreases. Dopamine, however, has countless other functions in the human body, so its alteration is so brutal. It's still a very crude measure, with some serious consequences. As I said, this topic is very sensitive, so some general clarifications need to be made. In 2022. Medicines today. One last glorious nail was hammered into the coffin of the serotonin depression myth. The study is a meta-analysis of hundreds of other studies, trying to determine if anyone has ever found any compelling causation. He was made by the heirs of the anti-psychiatry movement of the 1960s. And the answer found was, again, no, depression does not depend on serotonin. But, and there is a big but, this is not at all the same as saying that antidepressants are useless. And no one should take them anymore. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter with an extremely complex role in the human body, which is not fully understood. First of all, 95% of it is located, curiously, in the stomach and intestines. What are you doing there? It is also known that serotonin plays a role in sleep quality, emotional state, sexual function, appetite, in thought, memory, and the urge to vomit or not. So even if a meta-study demonstrates that depression is not caused by changes in serotonin, this does not mean that this neurotransmitter, so essential, somehow he doesn't participate in any way in this whole situation. For some people, antidepressants have a very palpable effect, like being lifted off the floor. Others feel only uncomfortable changes in all the systems listed earlier, without any beneficial effect on fundamental sadness. Others develop even more severe symptoms. The reaction varies so much because the medicine is based on a very imprecise scientific reasoning. The only reason it could be said to work is because sometimes it seems to work, sometimes it seems to do some good. To complicate matters further, there are countless studies that show that, on average, these serotonin boosters are no more effective than a placebo, respectively, a pill that is nothing, just a little sugar. And that in this whole process, what starts a momentum of healing? It's just the patient's belief that he's getting something that's going to make him better. And if he is convinced that he will get better, he is getting better, he is cured by the medicine called hope. But, another big but, it's very important that all these studies talk about average effectiveness, and in this way it is easy to lose sight of the fact that some people have a very good reaction to them. Why some and not others is not known. Serotonin may play an important role in some people's depression, and in the depression of others less. It is clear that antidepressants can be a tool, but they are also always a sledgehammer solution, which do not have the ability to cure anything in particular. They can only hope that it changes the mood of a man enough to allow him to get out of the pit so that something good can happen. This is the optimistic version of discourse regarding them, their positive potential under the conditions in which they are used. When there is no other solution to raise a fallen man. And for such cases, it is very good that these antidepressants exist. The speech, however, can become very negative very quickly when we look at how these drugs are actually used today. Expanding DSM categories allows them to be prescribed in every imaginable situation, as if they were the aspirin of the mind. When something is wrong, pop some antidepressants. Does your efficiency decrease around your period? Take some antidepressants to disrupt your brain's natural way of working. Let's see what happens. Maybe you can do that Excel after all. It's certainly irresponsible to suggest to people who depend on these drugs to simply stop taking them, without being replaced by other mechanisms. Important support and therapy. But I find it equally irresponsible to suggest that they have the ability to cure any defect and that taking their whole life is ever a very good solution in this whole story. In Europe, there still seems to be a decent level of caution in spreading them, but the level at which they are prescribed. These drugs in America are a nightmare, and because they have accumulated a 60-year tradition of sedating their population. There is a clear correlation between the level of neoliberalism in a country and the amount of drugs used. Psychiatrists, where programs and social networks are completely lacking, the simplest and cheapest solution is to drug people with problems. Adults are not the only ones targeted, who are not productive at work, but also children who do not behave regularly at school. Through the books read, there are countless testimonies of teenagers who presented themselves with some 16-year-old teenage problems, to which they were given an antidepressant. Potential adverse effects of these drugs are not in the category of sneezing and hives, but can induce intense states of anxiety, mania, and even more depression. Doctors give antidepressants to teenagers. Their condition worsens, and that becomes an argument for giving even more, even stronger, drugs. Because then maybe you don't just have depression, you're also bipolar, so you have to take an antipsychotic as well, and if you don't calm down, we add a benzodiazepine, a little bit of Xanax. This is not an exaggeration. This path from a little medicine to a brain-destroying cocktail is quite common in American psychiatry. This is how people wake up at 18 taking a drug that alters their serotonin system, another that alters the dopamine system, and another the GABA system that deals with restlessness and anxiety. What might healing look like under these conditions? How could you ever tell if you are healed? Any drug in these classes is enough to induce a deep state of absence. In the combination of all three, how could you ever function in the neighborhood of what could be called good? And then, if you don't get well, it's clear that you have to take it. These drugs still. If you ever try to quit, withdrawal from these drugs produces the symptoms that were to be treated with them. Withdrawal then becomes evidence that you are not yet cured, so you must continue taking these medicines. This is what the spiral of abject use of drug treatment for mental disorders looks like. And it has a lot to do with the combination of psychiatry and capitalism and very little to do with it. With some sort of medical science or therapeutic intent. This discussion is difficult. Because in a sense all arguments are valid at the same time. Yes, it is true that it is good that it exists, these tools for situations where there is no other alternative. Under the right conditions, they really can save lives. But at the same time, it is as true as can be that at present they are not at all limited to the right conditions, but increasingly offered as a universal solution, where they can certainly destroy lives in a completely free way. It is dangerous to think that these drugs will cure something, because then it seems that we have already solved the problem, so why bother to find better alternatives? It is difficult, however, to discuss in generalities about the value of these drugs when they are so indispensable for some people, as well as spread in a completely irresponsible way, enthusiastically sold as the simplest and most effective solution. Today's DSM-5, by totally pathologizing the human experience, opens the door wide. So anyone can become a candidate for this road to chemical brain breakdown roulette. Let's see what happens. In our culture, there is no more space or time to determine what a perfectly justified sadness and what a mental disturbance that we must produce. The important thing is that, in short, you are sick with unproductiveness, and we don't know exactly why, but we don't even have time to figure it out, we only have these medicines. In Romania, in a way, we are lucky that this culture of treating any existential discomfort with such potent drugs is not so developed. We have been, historically, rather at the opposite pole, where perhaps they have been used too little, because in our country existential discomfort is traditionally treated with alcohol and that's it. Again, these drugs are not bad in themselves, they can be a valuable tool used correctly and especially for a limited time. If they can provide a window into which you can gain another perspective on your existence, a breath from which you can develop strategies for how to continue existing, then they are great. But they cannot be considered a final station, a cure, by themselves. All these mental disorders are not some viruses dropped from space that inexplicably make people. Either they are too sad, or they are too agitated, or they are no longer very sure of the surrounding reality. All these problems occur in the relationship between man and his environment, in the relationship between a human being, the sensitivity of her brain, and the experiences she is subjected to. In this equation, there are sequelae that look like one of these so-called mental illnesses. But there is no objective tool to predict the development of any such disorder at the individual level. There are averages and statistics, but no one has any authority, no basis, to say that the mental disorder you suffer from, in particular, it may not improve substantially for the rest of your life. When you are told this, what it really means is that there are no resources for you in this society. Who has the time and space and patience to understand what is going on with you specifically? And then that's it, or isn't it the same as saying that a disease is incurable? At such points, it becomes essential what we mean by the word disease. It still exists in all these discussions. An absurd focus on the physiological processes of these disorders. After 150 years, the answers are still sought somewhere deep in the human body where the defect is to be found. Because if we find it, then we just need to produce the right substance, and thus, we will finally eradicate the virus of sadness. The problem is that we don't have that perfect substance yet, that's all. By the environment that produces these disturbances, we cannot touch the quality of human life itself. How can we not adjust our society? We adjust our brain chemistry that, in essence, it's much easier, that it's just a pill to swallow. At one point I became exasperated reading studies upon studies comparing the 5-year effect in a vacuum on some depressed people who took medication or not. We arrive at some data that shows that some are better off and others don't, and then we say, so those drugs are good or not. But what happened in those 5 years? In the lives of those people? What does their daily life look like? They made friends, they lost friends, have they found new things to love or what? Treating anxiety, depression and psychosis, without any relation to the conditions of everyday life, it cannot be anything but absurd. If these things actually play a role in 90% of these disorders, and we sit and do endless studies, just what can we put in numbers? We sit and measure myopic neurotransmitters. Biopsychosocial. The most consistent and compelling alternative to this approach to mental illness is organized today around the concepts of trauma and stress. Trauma creates a vulnerability, a breeding ground for mental disorders. And stress keeps triggering them. Research in this direction developed following the understanding deeper into the phenomenon called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In the 1980s in America, it was discovered that traumatized war veterans in Vietnam were not just having nightmares, but every night they experienced anew, head-to-tail, traumatic episodes as they had happened in reality. These episodes could also be triggered by various surrounding stimuli that transported the person back to the traumatic moment, as we can see in the first Rambo, from 1982. Up to this point, the concept of trauma belonged more to the arena of psychoanalysis and Freudian theories, where it was not very clear. What can constitute a trauma? It's something that happens to you objectively, from the outside. Like something hits you in the head, or trauma can also be an invisible reaction from inside you. As there was no consensus on these things, no scientific use seemed possible of the concept of trauma. That's what changes these studies on PTSD. They were trying to show how a traumatic event can chemically imprint itself on the memory of a human organism, respectively, that such an episode can profoundly alter the body's response to stress. That following a shock, the hormonal response of a human body to stress changes in the long term. These ideas, they developed in the late 80s, then exploded in the 90s, and then got trashed as pseudoscience, especially because of the way they were interpreted by the general public. The field then received a completely unexpected resuscitation after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, when the political victimization of Americans embraced the concept of trauma to the fullest because it was very useful. In the 1980s, when it came to the Vietnam War, the U.S. government was not at all friendly to the prospect. To research the exact way he destroyed his own young citizens for life, so that focus on trauma she was a bit anti-patriotic. But after September 11th, everyone was talking about national trauma. What had been a national trauma. Let it be clear that the Americans were victims, not aggressors, so in response, funds for research into the nature of trauma have been raised. Today, it is as clear as possible that trauma is not a binary concept, i.e. either you have it or you don't, but it exists on a very wide spectrum. It seems that you can very well not have been to war, and yet have some emotional experiences intense enough, especially in childhood, to condition your way where your mind and body develop. That's a very complicated way to come to a conclusion, in fact, as trivial as possible, formulated already over 100 years ago, respectively, the experiences of your life, they are what dictate how your mind and body work. It is fundamentally wrong anyway. Let's say mind and body, because they are not two distinct entities, the only reason it seems normal to make this distinction is that, historically, it has been made. But the things that have an impact on your body, they affect the mind, and those that impact the mind, affect the body. There is no boundary between the two, just one that we artificially impose out of habit. That being said, a trauma is an emotional wound strong enough to be imprinted in your system, a shock that leaves a mark. Trauma is not found in what happened to you physically, observable from the outside, but in the way a certain experience was emotionally registered in you. Trauma is the inner reaction, and in this way, it can be perfectly invisible. Sufficient suffering. It has the ability to alter the way your body works in the long term. The remaining wound, while it remains open, causes pain when touched in the slightest way. If it still doesn't close, then the instinctive step towards self-preservation is to isolate yourself in some way, in which nothing touches her, in which you are no longer touched. When or if the wound heals, however, then it creates some emotional rigidities in you. You are no longer as elastic, it is much harder to adapt to various situations to which, otherwise, you might have wanted to adapt. In other words, accumulated, your scars, your traumas, dictate how much emotional flexibility you have or don't have. Emotional flexibility means the ability to decide how you will react in a certain situation, versus an automatic, uncontrollable reaction. The more scars, the more stiffness, the more automatic response to certain situations. This logic applies from the smallest cases, where you can't adjust your response to certain stimuli without arguing with people, to the point that you cannot adapt your response to the environment without slipping into psychosis. There is no man on this planet free of emotional wounds and scars from life experiences. The only difference is that some had bruises from falls when they were playing as children, and others fell from airplanes, and yet they survived, put emotional trucks on them, together, years in a row, and yet they survived. What your mind should look like, or how it might work, after surviving such experiences? What we call mental illnesses are actually the result of some survival mechanisms of the human being. A vulnerable mind, faced with intolerable levels of suffering and shock, he must make some adaptations to enable him to continue his existence. These adaptations, although in the short term they have the role of saving our lives, in the long term they become scars, which no longer allow us who knows what other movements beyond those which, historically, they kept us alive. Today, statistically, the link between childhood difficulties and mental disorders is as clear as the link between smoking and lung cancer. The more traumas and shocks you had in childhood, the more likely you are to develop mental disorders. The more severe these shocks were, the more severe the mental difficulties can be. The intensity of childhood trauma, for example, is directly correlated with the intensity and frequency of psychoses in schizophrenia. Anyone can develop mental disorders at any point in life. But if you had experiences unfortunate in childhood, then you have a vulnerability in your base that can manifest extra intense mental difficulties. At maturity, bad experiences do not only mean the presence of shocks, but also the absence of essential elements, the absence of positive connections that allow you to develop your emotional branches. It is very important to emphasize that there is no objective scale for what constitutes intolerable suffering or shock. Each person has their own threshold, depending on their inner sensitivity. A child's basic needs are among the clearest things known in psychiatry today. A child needs affection, connection, attention, play, and generally safety. It needs these things like a tree needs light and water to grow. A child's brain develops, physically, depending on how much and how the parents interact with it, or the adults who care for him. It is not only direct interactions that influence this development, but also the general condition of the adults around. In our capacity as mammals with young that need the longest care until they are independent, children's brains are incredibly sensitive to the emotional climate in which they grow. Even if a parent ticks off all the regulatory moves in direct interaction with the child, if the rest of the time he is stressed, depressed, angry, these things will also be imprinted in the most direct way possible in emotional development of the child. This is incredibly important to understand. But that doesn't mean it's the parent's fault for everything, because parents are not entities that exist in a vacuum, but also human beings limited by their own scars, who must be able to suddenly reconcile all the pressures of everyday life with caring for a small person of an impossible sensitivity. Even so, unfortunately, there is no more important factor in a man's development than the emotional climate in which his neural networks were formed. For example, if, as a child, you grow up in some circumstances where there is a very high level of insecurity, one option is to adapt by becoming hypervigilant. You involuntarily develop a level of perpetual worry, a general anxiety. We are not only talking about physical insecurity, but also emotional unpredictability, an environment where the condition appears and disappears according to some coordinates you do not understand, and which you have no way of understanding. In such unmanageable conditions, a small human being makes some dramatic and far-reaching adaptations that are always meant to limit overwhelming suffering. Faced with constant worry, a child does not sit and ruminate lying in bed, thinking about the best solution, but they try to find ways to distract themselves so that they don't feel all those scary emotions anymore. In this way, a very powerful impulse to constantly escape from a present that is difficult to face is installed. These kinds of solutions found in moments of crisis then become the neural templates for our adult behaviors. We don't have other molds, we have to work with this material. We are always a continuation, uninterrupted, of our childhood experiences, which at some point start to seem very distant and, so, irrelevant, but they remain relevant as long as we are alive, because, again, then our brains were molded around those experiences formed, physiologically, our emotional reactions to surrounding challenges. Depression is also a mechanism. Compensation for prolonged suffering that might otherwise have driven you completely out of your mind. Moreover, the mechanism of depression is considered something normal under the right conditions. If someone close to you dies, it is universally accepted that the grieving process involves some level of depression. It is very likely that this mechanism exists in mammals as a self-preservation process, of compensating for the panic of a sudden separation, of self-damping so that to limit the potential for various dangerous behaviors. Because not only man gets depressed, but also numerous other mammals in distressing conditions, such as in zoos. I, for one, have historically understood my depressions as times when, overwhelmed by all sorts of things, of sad and angry feelings, I implode instead of exploding. Explosions are dangerous, unpredictable, they can hurt people you care about who are not at fault, so it seems a lot more reasonable to simply collapse inside yourself and thus disappear. This mechanism, that naturally exists in our brains, can be very easily hijacked by other suffering and overwhelm, which need not necessarily involve any outwardly visible death. Maybe only you see what dies. Depression is traditionally associated with sadness, but it is fundamentally a disconnection from yourself, from your own feelings, so that you feel nothing. In a depression, there is always the ghost of mute sadness, but the feeling is more of emotional paralysis, because the goal is numbing you to any potentially dangerous intensity. At the end of this spectrum, with self-disconnection, we find psychosis. If you don't have the faintest idea what psychosis might entail, I recommend you pause the clip and read this text written by Iulia Marin in 2019, called Crazy in Romania. It is the most detailed description of the development of a psychosis that I have ever read, written by the person who was going through these things. I can't say more on YouTube about what happened to her. Psychosis can be understood as a dissociation of maximum intensity. All mental disorders exist, in fact, on this spectrum of dissociation, of disconnection from one's own person in some impossible conditions to process or bear. Self-disconnection has the role of distancing yourself from some feelings for which you have no working processing model. As I already said, the surest predictor of psychosis in adulthood are childhood traumas, when a child has a sufficiently shocking experience so that his mind has to completely leave the surrounding reality. This shock remains imprinted in the available list of mind reactions to threatening situations, so in adulthood, under conditions of great stress, the mind can easily slip into psychosis. In something that, basically, it was a self-preservation mechanism. The other big myth of mental illness, besides chemical imbalance, it's the genetic cause. Despite 25 years of constant efforts to find the genes responsible, no gene has been found that contains the recipe for any mental illness. There doesn't seem to be such a thing. What has been discovered, however, very relevantly, is that your genetic material can dictate a certain level of sensitivity, higher or lower, to the environment. Sensitivity, in genetic terms, it means a body that changes its chemistry more intensively in response to various stimuli. This sensitivity is what can make the difference between a baby who always sleeps peacefully and one who cries incessantly, which creates an even more stressful situation for parents who reflect the stress back towards the child who, as a result, cries even more. For such reasons, for raising healthy children, real resources are needed, a dedicated emotional space, which should be identified and protected as such by these societies in which we live. However, genetic susceptibility means, in general, that both positive and negative situations will be felt even more intensely. What is being discovered in genetics in the last 20 years is, in fact, how our characteristics, more specific, do not depend so much on certain genes, respectively certain code letters, which you either have or you don't, and then you either have depression or you don't. Epigenetic phenomena are much more relevant, personalized adaptations in when and how a gene is activated. These adaptations are made quickly, between generations. Some parents who suffered in some historical famine may produce children with a lower need for calories, adjust to the lack of food in the environment. In this way, human complexity expressed through these genetic microadaptations, it is incredibly vast. You may have a specific vulnerability to certain mental disorders because you have certain sensitivities. But then it completely depends of the environment you grow up in if those sensitivities are identified and harnessed as skills, or if a toxic environment throws those same sensitivities completely on their heads. And it blocks your mind in some labyrinths where you lose yourself. Nor genetic vulnerabilities, nor does anything influence your mental stability more than the series of experiences through which you have passed since your 0th day of existence on this earth. If there were safety ones, if you have enjoyed an uninterrupted sense of security in your life, then you are all the more likely to have stronger emotional stability, a more solid base, from which you cannot be knocked down too easily by winds of higher intensities. If, instead, in your growth you spent more time in a state of accumulated insecurity, tension, worry, pressure, and isolation, then you never had a good time to develop some healthy roots that connects you well with reality, so that you are not carried away by storms when I come. Any drugs used to treat these problems must be coupled with other therapies to help a man develop his roots, not just artificially stop the wind and that's it. Because once the medicines are stopped, the wind can return with accumulated force over some roots that are still weak. And then how could any kind of healing miraculously happen? I keep repeating this in various forms because it seems to me particularly important to understand. Returning a bit to schizophrenia, it is widely accepted though that there is a risk you can inherit if in your immediate family someone had schizophrenia. But a better way to understand this risk is not that you can inherit schizophrenia, but that you inherit a high sensitivity, which can be exploded by various stressful phenomena. Such a stressful phenomenon can also be drug use, and people who have a first psychotic episode following use usually aligns heightened sensitivity with childhood trauma with drug use, a common alignment. Having said that, schizophrenia, that ultimate bauble of mental illness, it means, most often, a chronicling of psychoses. A schizophrenic man is a man whose mind, in response to stress, he keeps slipping into psychosis. But psychosis is also found in other disorders, because it is just a defense mechanism of a vulnerable mind faced with too much. How treatable schizophrenia is depends on the care system a person can benefit from, so that his brain no longer slips into extreme self-defense in the face of overwhelming stress. The reason schizophrenia is said to be incurable is that, historically, people with chronic psychotic conditions did not receive the necessary care, they have not benefited from understanding time and space, and their condition has progressively deteriorated. In general, diagnoses in psychiatry today are circular. How do you know someone has schizophrenia? Because he has chronic psychosis. Why does he have chronic psychosis? Because he has schizophrenia. And here we close the discussion and prescribe antipsychotics for life, because it seems otherwise way too hard to do at the moment. Despite her therapeutic intentions in individual cases, on a broad level psychiatry today functions as a method of keeping things in society accurate. As I am. If our story about these disorders is that they are deficiencies located in each individual human, that just need to be compensated privately with the right substances, then we can put a lid on the problem. And see you further from work as well. If these disturbances, however, on such a large scale, are clearly caused by living conditions, shocks and stress levels, then we must face them with the fact that there is something very wrong with the ways we have to operate today, something wrong enough so as to make us severely ill. In this way, psychiatry, in its ability to establish what is normality and what is mental disorder, always has a very high political stake somewhere. What is the normal amount of sadness and worry about our present that if you get over it, it means you have a problem, you are sick and you need to take pills? 13% of Americans. I have been taking antidepressants for over 12 years. About 30 million people. Europe is behind, but here too. In recent years, especially after the pandemic, it has started to grow dramatically. Use of psychiatric drugs, more in some countries and less in others. What we call stress is a natural mechanism of the body that goes into a state of alert to face challenges. The purpose of this mechanism is to save our lives when we come across various dangerous or threatening situations. This state of stress implies an alteration of the balance of one's own body, in which there is an excess of certain hormones and neurotransmitters. So stress is something as physical as possible. In isolated episodes he is essential, because he is meant to give you some extra resources to deal with the threat. But chronically, stretched over very long periods, stress begins to have a corrosive effect on the body, who is not made to sit in such a state of endless overexcitement. Long-term stress, as demonstrably as possible. All these things are well documented, beyond any doubt. So stress is not a kind of girl, a kind of minor emotional discomfort that can be ignored if you focus your stoicism. Today, science has also identified the most effective solution to combat the most widespread kind of existing stress. If you want to stop suffering from all these things that I have talked about, the solution is just to stop being poor. If our existence depends entirely on money, and the money situation may vary according to some currents far beyond our ability to predict, how could we not exist in a state of constant alertness? Which is as clear as can be. is that there is an absolutely gigantic mental health difference between earning 3,000 Romanian lei per month in this country and win 3,000 euros. From one point onwards, the differences become smaller and smaller, because your life is not so dramatically affected if you start earning 5,000 euros instead of 3,000. But the difference between 3,000 lei and 3,000 euros means the difference between having to calculate absolutely every move, everything you buy, everything you don't buy if something unforeseen happens to you, all these things. They can't help but keep you in a constant state of stress. In a condition that makes you physically ill. Day by day that shrinks you, forces you to fragment and reduce you. If you understand that the biggest cause of mental illness and physical illness is poverty, then this whole capitalism thing. It doesn't seem so funny anymore. That there is a real urgency to compensate for the gigantic differences between the living standards that separate people today. That these differences sicken and kill people in as direct a way as possible. There would be an infinity of things to say, but I will stop here for reasons which pertain to my own mental health. So a recap. Under the title of mental illness, what we find today are only some groupings of certain symptoms that manifest as a response, at various levels, more or less catastrophic, of shock and stress. In some important sense to understand, these mental illnesses do not exist as distinct entities. There is not, as it were, the virus of depression or schizophrenia. There are just whole constellations of symptoms, of adaptations and responses to shock and stress, which we reductively group under the names of anxiety, depression, bipolarity, and so on. Saying something is depression does nothing to understand what the root of the problem is. To that man. There are enough psychiatrists today who are aware of all these things, and who began to work beyond such labels. The effect of DSM-5 today, with all his apparent scientific rigor in identifying 374 mental disorders, he promotes, directly or indirectly, the notion that these diseases really are concrete entities that you discover, which you either have or you don't. Whereas they are just labels slapped on incredible complexity of the human brain in its adaptation and survival mechanisms. In 2013, 10 years ago, when this DSM-5 came out, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health in America, a fairly large institution, wrote the following. He wrote these things to say then, that the National Institute of Mental Health will no longer be guided by diagnoses, those of the DSM, but will reorient to other possible approaches to mental disorders. It is, however, also true that the general public often embraces these labels with some enthusiasm, because if you keep feeling bad, someone tell you that there is a name for what you are suffering from. It can feel like a release. That you are not imagining things, but actually a problem that affects many other people. It's basically a form of validation of your experiences. And indeed, these tags can be extremely helpful in understanding that there are very similar patterns in the ways in which human beings react to shock and stress, especially from positions of vulnerability. But what unites us is that we have had and have, all of us, difficult life experiences, not that we are each individually defective and insufficient. This notion of chemical imbalances also has a very serious effect. To disconnect a man from his personal experiences. It was not the things he suffered in life that produced these difficulties, but various biological deficiencies that must be compensated by certain substances. This message, although in the short term it may be useful in making the pill slide down the throat more easily, in the long term, it installs a fundamental confusion in the relationship between what happens to you and how you mentally react. It is, first of all, a discouraging message that makes mental disorder an abstract problem, fallen from the sky, with whom you can interact strictly through the specialized help of psychiatry. In other words, the approach where you just give medicine and that's it, period, can very easily miss the point, the meaning and effect of suffering in a man's life. The way to ameliorate the problem. It cannot help but include an understanding of the problem in the context in which it arose. So the much more reasonable way to understand mental disorders today is according to a model called biopsychosocial. Accordingly, recognizing the interdependence between feelings and physiology, recognize that what and how you feel changes how your body functions, and that these things are intensely determined by the social environment. This approach is actually nothing new. It was already proposed more than 100 years ago, but the lesson is very difficult to assimilate by our societies, because if you take it that way, the subject of mental disorders acquires a very large political dimension. Drug addiction is a clear example of a biopsychosocial illness. The vast majority of people with mental disorders do not reach any psychologist and no psychiatrist, but try to treat their difficulties themselves with whatever substances they find around, from alcohol to heroin. No one chooses to become addicted to drugs for the sake of it. Consumption becomes chronic when it satisfies a very important need, when it fulfills something that otherwise sorely missing. Dealing with these things through arrests and jails is simply criminal. Another scandalous example of diagnosis is ADHD in children, their attention deficit and hyperactivity. In America, 5.3 million children are diagnosed with ADHD. 6 out of 10 of them are diagnosed, in addition to ADHD, and with anxiety or depression. 11.5% of American children, between 12 and 17 years old, have ADHD. This means that, in a class of 30 children, at least 3 have a diagnosis of ADHD. What can we learn from this label? Something is happening, but what? Do millions of children have chemical deficiencies caused by a defective organism? This disease is mainly diagnosed in relation to the ability to be good at school or not, the ability to sit still and absorb the information you are given. Is there societal reasons to believe that this ability is increasingly endangered? Children are always the most sensitive mirror of imbalances that exist in society. If we adults, it is increasingly difficult for us to sit still without scrolling or without being connected to various screens, then how could it be much easier for children? An undeniable effect, accepted and talked about endlessly, is that all the scrolling on the internet induces a certain level lack of attention, lack of patience between impulses to stimulate you. It is clear today that the way a child's brain develops depends directly on the condition of the adults around him, because the chemistry of a child's body is directly connected to the chemistry of the adult who takes care of him. These millions of children who have ADHD, what adults do they have with them? Not these overstressed adults, overstimulated, who have great difficulty sitting still and being present in the present moment. If this is a major difficulty in adults, how could it be less in children? And then what kind of idea is it to treat this whole situation by giving children amphetamines? Or by giving amphetamines, better, to everyone? Until when can this be done as a solution? And in this case, there are definitely situations where drugs can help in severe cases. But this does not change the fact that, according to all data, this disease, like all others, it has some biopsychosocial origins. Respectively, mental and physiological adaptations of man are in response to certain social conditions of existence. How about trying to treat those social conditions of existence, instead of giving drugs to everyone? What would it look like, for example? A world that has as its central axis the fundamental needs of children? One in which they prioritize, to the maximum, the space and time necessary to give children the affection, attention, and security they need, one in which all other things are organized according to this absolute priority. Obviously, in order for these conditions to be provided to children, adults themselves must exist in a state that is not characterized by an infinite run. The way it should work. Adults today is rarely compatible with the good development of their own children, something that many people seem to realize, reason and why there are fewer and fewer children. I imagine that a mature civilization would understand the priority of raising children, because there is no better way to improve the future than by creating beings as connected as possible to their own humanity and to those around them, some beings who have the necessary space for the widest possible empathy. Today we are almost at the opposite pole of that. The dysfunctional nature of our society. It produces some traumatized people who learn to reduce themselves in such a way that they don't care anymore of absolutely nothing other than one's own person. Because caring about things hurts, so it's best to feel as little as possible. Who learns the lesson best? Who is scarred in a way the more conducive? Whoever gets rid of empathy as completely as possible, those people become the perfect candidates for positions of political and economic power from which to further perpetuate the same traumatic system. A slightly more optimistic last word about healing. If childhood trauma and stress, it creates some emotional scars that limit what kind of reactions you can have, then healing means the flexibility of these reactions. Developing the ability to choose how to respond in certain situations, not to have automatic reactions conditioned by your past sufferings. To be able to influence such things, you must first have a minimal acceptance and understanding of the processes that led you to the landscape. Your emotional current. You must operate with a minimum level of self-embracing. With a level of compassion for yourself as a human being subject to all kinds of conditions, which she did not choose to be subjected to, and which she had to deal with as best she could. Unfortunately, the most common way in which children internalize bizarre, incomprehensible situations, it's by thinking it's their fault. If you don't get what you need from the environment, you have the option to believe that the world around you is unstable and unpredictable, or that you are doing something wrong to not get what you need. The notion of the fundamental instability of the world is something completely terrifying to a child, because it implies a lack of control impossible to process, so the only other intelligible option, it's that he's doing something wrong and everything will be fine again if he finds that perfect way to behave. In this way, most traumas settle in people, coupled with the idea that it is their fault, one way or another, and it's not. And it never was. We all exist in a flow. Constant suffering that is passed down from generation to generation through no one's fault in particular, because no one in particular started this cycle. Self-compassion is absolutely vital to survive vaguely balanced in this world today. Because above all other things of which we have spoken, there has never been before, no man living in the year 2023, with all the new and exciting challenges that exist today, perpetually connected to a quantity impossible by constant stimuli, many of which repeat endlessly that the future doesn't look good at all. We are all living in some conditions that are truly unprecedented, some that are completely unclear. How and how much you should be able to function, so ideally we should be patient with ourselves and to discuss with each other what is happening to us, because it is not at all minor to our mental capacities. When suffering becomes debilitating, the best first step available today is to go to psychotherapy, go talk to someone who is familiar with general human patterns of suffering. The general purpose of the various types of psychotherapies that exist today is precisely the flexibility of scars, starting, first of all, with their identification. There is absolutely no man on this planet who doesn't like talking to a knowledgeable person about their own emotional problems. Regardless of how serious your problems are or not, it's never a bad idea to talk to another human being about inner difficulties. If that is not enough and the suffering continues to be debilitating, then it is ideal for the psychotherapist to do drug treatment together with the psychiatrist, in which a concrete plan is established for how long it should be taken, for what purpose, what happens after. Unfortunately, these support systems are still underdeveloped, expensive and difficult to access, because mental health, being invisible, retains the appearance of a kind of face. Because we can't see with the naked eye, like an inflammation, we can pretend it's not incredibly important, that it doesn't have a huge effect on our lives, that we can keep it that way, if nothing visible breaks. That's just a lapse in perception. What can remain as clear as possible from all this discussion is that certainly the way in which the dimension of mental disorders is approached today is very, very far from optimal. Things cannot stay like this. There is still a lot of room for understanding, better systems, and treatments. I left the main books I used for documentation in the description. Anatomy of an Epidemic is the story of drugs used in psychiatry, in a much more pessimistic tone than the one I used, because the situation in America is quite serious. Then Mind Fixers. It's the long story of the failure to find the brain defects responsible for mental disorders. Then Psychiatric Hegemony is a book that analyzes psychiatry in relation to power structures of society, and how it has always functioned as the tool that defines mental normality, depending on the cultural norms of the societies. It's a very interesting and valuable analysis with an infantile conclusion, respectively, that psychiatry and psychology should be abolished completely, starting tomorrow. That will solve everything. And finally, I read Gabor Mate's book, which indexes current efforts to understand mental disorders as biopsychosocial phenomena. The book does a good, if somewhat chaotic, job of arguing why this pattern. It's the only reasonable one today. That's all. Thank you so much for your constant support on Patreon. I wish you all as much self-compassion as possible. Respectively, not so much compassion for automobiles as for their own persons.